Welcome to episode 2 of the podcast Being Reintegrated. So we are continuing with the Treatise of Benedictions. Please see the first podcast if you're not familiar with this work. And what we're doing is we're going through it to get a feel for what exactly is being said by Saint Martin. So as we go through different AI voices, reading these unpublished documents, I will momentarily stop the audio and potentially give commentary or insights and context on the information being presented. So here we go with part 2.
The blessing of production is itself guided by the ternary number, which, being imprinted on all created things, clearly indicates that it presided over their origin. This is taught in the instructions of the order, symbolized by the triangle, and through the 3 spiritual acts that contributed to the production of material essences through the operation of the spirits of the central axis. It pertains to the life of these essences through the joining of a powerful being to their vessel of passive life, and to the perfect temporal existence of transient beings through the explosion caused by this powerful connection.
So they're already talking about the central axis fire. And that, when I first heard it in 20 years ago, I first heard it and I read the 10 instructions of Saint Martin, which at that time were called the 10 instructions to Lyon. They're actually not. The Lyon lessons are something different. But in the 10 instructions to the men of desire, the temple of, I think it wasn't even Lyon Elus Coen, because Lyon Elus Coen was ran by Willermose. So I believe it was the temple of Versailles, and Saint Martin was instructing those in the temple grades of the Elus Coen. So what he was instructing about was the axis of central fire, which was super, super confusing to me when I first read it. I was like, what in the world is this term? I kind of just filed it for future reference and then kept reading, which I didn't understand hardly anything that was being read at the time, because I didn't have any familiarity with the Elus Coen system at all, and certainly didn't have the advantage of being exposed to multiple sources, should we say. So what happened was I read it and then I didn't get it, and I just went along with my own business. Well, it took about a decade or two later that I actually understood what the central axis fire kind of is from Saint Martin's writings. And if you go to the instructions of Versailles, or the instructions to the men of desire, you will start to see what Saint Martin is saying. What he's saying is that the central axis of fire is the central deposit for all of these unrefined essences of our being. And they call those the philosophical matras, the 3 philosophical matras. So the fact that the blessings are being brought into the realm of 3 is very, very important. But you wouldn't know that if you weren't familiar with what they're talking about. So what Saint Martin was saying is that in the beginning of the essences of our essence, basically, they're undetermined, and that means that they don't have any distinguishing. So it's just called the central axis of fire because it's the one place where, not place, but it's the one source and substance of the, basically in alchemy they call it the prima materia. So what the central axis of fire most essentially relates to is our quintessence or prima materia in the language of alchemy. And then what happens as the matter starts to refine itself, it takes on these 1, 2, and 3 properties. which were really, really difficult, like I said, to start to understand. Um, and what happens is as the central axis of fire spirits start to work upon these substances, they have the right and responsibility to build the philosophical mercury, the philosophical sulfur, and the philosophical salt, or the three alchemical principles. And these are the body, the blood, and the uh, bones, of that nature. So what? And that's not in the order. I mean, you can definitely go ahead and read the commentaries that are in the new publication of 10 instructions, which are amazing. And the footnotes, there's like 180 or 90 footnotes that commentate upon this document, and give an insider's view. The late Paul Rana gave an insider's view of what the document was saying. And we're extremely grateful to him for doing so. So what happened is that the philosophical mantras, the three principles, became differentiated, and that's how they went into the realm of matter. And so it's very interesting that Saint Martin is talking about this particular schemata, but he's not mentioning it. He's basically like, if you know, you know, and that's all that we're going to talk about it. But he's bringing the blessing, the apostolic blessing, into the realm of temporal beings, which Willermo's also in the Lessons of Leon, and a lot of his Leon reform of the Elus Coen and Elus Coen teachings. He calls them secondary causes, which he did get from Martinez. That's in the Treatise of Reintegration. And Martinez is very strict about saying that the eternal is only focused on first causes, not secondary causes. So we're seeing some of the inner metaphysics of the secondary causes right now with this lecture of Saint Martin.
This explosion operates through all the powers and elemental beings contained within the philosophical matrix, the universal cradle of all material nature. This initial blessing of production is repeated daily by individuals and particular bodies that populate this universe. Just like the universal production, they follow a ternary law that governs them, and they adhere to it with the same accuracy. They, too, have their philosophical matrix of spiritual essences, an indifferent stage of connection that determines them, and finally an explosion that puts them into their state of temporal perfection, just as there is for the universe as a whole. However, it is true that for them, the explosion occurs much more slowly than it did for the universal production, it is much more subject to time. Here's the reason: since they possess only a specific action and life within them, which is but an emanation of the general production's action and life, they cannot possess the same power. So, where can the same power be demonstrated if not in the promptness and swiftness of execution? This is why their particular productions are subject to a slower and sequential growth in formation, which the universal production did not experience. This same reason for the inferiority of the power of individual beings, which has subjected their production to be slower, also subjects their existence to be less enduring. This is why particular corporeal beings cannot have a life and existence as long as the universal beings of creation. The latter, being the foundations and fundamental pillars of creation, must last as long as creation itself.
So now we're hearing a very, very interesting take on the elements. As everyone knows, these were talked about very intensively by Paracelsus, Agrippa, on and on and on. But what we didn't hear is that what these elements were that we were discussing and reading and learning about were logoic forces. And that is what Saint Martin is cluing us into right now, is that these logoic forces must exist, coming from the Greek existente, they must have a presence in the universe. They have to have a location. They have to have a definition. They have to have parameters and constants by which they exist, because these are the fundamental building blocks that the verb or the word uses to organize the entire universe. And as you heard me say in the previous episode, I was going to say lecture, but these are podcasts. So, what you heard me say in the previous episode is about the stoichion. And that is in antiquity, it was believed to be the Platonic solids. These are the fundamental building blocks of the universe that cannot be altered in the sense that they can be eliminated. And this is the interesting part about the blessing of reintegration, is because it's saying that these are temporal beings. These are not universal beings. So what's happening is science in the 17th century is being displaced by the presence of these spiritual forces, which was a big no-no in the Age of Enlightenment, which was really I guess you could call it the exaltation of the reasonal function. That was supposedly the evolutionary pinnacle of all human progress, was that we got into science and that we learned how the mechanics of the universe worked, and on and on and on. And what this did is it turned the spiritual universe into a mechanistic universe. And for those who are Lord of the Ring fans, this is the exact portion of the Lord of the Rings doctrine that starts to talk about how there was a takeover by a dark force where people were lost and they had no ability to connect with the previous spiritual beings. Now, I don't know if Tolkien was a Elus Coen or was familiar with the doctrines of the Elus Coen, but the Lord of the Rings and its antecedents in the Silmarillion, I won't go on too long, but they have very strong roots of Elus Coen doctrine.
Have within them a principle of life whose strength and power are analogous to their purpose. However much the difference in time, duration, existence, and production of individual corporeal beings may be in relation to the general creation, it is very certain that the laws that concern them in all their actions absolutely bear the same number. It is the same ternary that guides the production of individual corporeal beings as it guided the production of the universal body. The blessing of preservation is the one that perpetuates the existence of all corporeally produced beings. It merely sustains existing productions according to the same laws and numbers that formed them. Thus, this kind of blessing is as necessary as the first for the life of beings, or rather, it is intimately linked with it and somewhat dependent on it, as it is its natural consequence. The blessing of production, having operated for time, must absolutely have its effect, which is the temporal duration of corporeal things, in accordance with the number and action that constituted them. In essence, the result of this first blessing, which must necessarily have a course, reiterates the connection between thought and will. Indeed, there is certainly no thought without some form of will following it. The difference between the two is easy to discern. The thoughts and will of free beings, though inseparable, always leave some uncertainty about the kind of outcome or will that a free being might generate.
And that is the beauty of the metaphysics of Martinez, is that free beings have a will, and their will is based on logoic principles. So they have the powers to be able to do something, to make a change, but the changes that they can do are only in the realm of temporality, which is so amazing how you get the deism of there's a godhead that's separate from the rest of humanity, but you don't get the theism that says that there's a God that's separate from humanity, and it'll never be met. You have what's in Martinez's system is called the reconciler. You have a mediating presence between those two realms of ultimate privation and ultimate substance, which is really the word. And that's what San Martin is talking about right now. He's saying that the will is empowered to do things because it's from free beings. It's empowered to do anything that the logoic constants will let it do. So this answers the question why bad things happen. Bad things are not necessarily bad in and of their nature. I mean, there are some, of course, very, very evil and bad things. For the most part, though, however, they are just distortions of the universal principles that already exist. So I just love to see how those two realms are being brought together. That there's a transcendent, ineffable power that emanated all beings, yet is distant from the works of those beings, because part of emanating those beings was emanating universal constants as mediating principles between itself and the world that it's having creations done in.
Because even the most resolute will can waver and become entirely opposed to what it was before. However, the physical material result originating from subordinate agents, which are not free, is not subject to the same variation. The agent that operates it and the agent that orders it, having faculties only for one single purpose, which is the good, it is impossible for their deeds to be destroyed before the time allotted for their existence. Thus,
wow. Not to give too much commentary, but what Saint Martin is again saying is that, I mean, if you heard it, you heard it, is that free beings have to be able to create temporal structures. And that is so amazing to see in the, I guess you would call meta of the entire metaphysic of what we're talking about right now. That in order to be free, there would have to be evil that could be created, but that evil couldn't be part of the good because there can't be a universal constant force that forces the will of these free beings to create something that is constant with that one thing. It's amazing how Martinez was able to postulate the dualism while keeping the unified perspective. That they're both right. There is a definite duality in our universe, but there's also a singularity, not the AI, but there's a singularity of consciousness that definitely, once we move toward that unity, there's a unifying structure within it, which is very similar to what Albert Pike called order out of chaos. We're ordering a world based on our will, but the world itself isn't ordered in and of itself. It's a neutral playing field for the willpower of the individuals that have freedom to operate that function within that playing field. Pretty profound stuff. And I don't know of anywhere else that it's spoken of with this tightness of language and this coherent of a presentation. These are disparate areas that you'll hear about, maybe in Gnosticism, maybe in Neoplatonism. You might hear a little bit about it in, some mysticism of Meister Eckhart, on and on and on, the Pietists. But you're not going to hear a presentation that links all of these factors together so seamlessly like this.
the maintenance of the works that have come from their hands is necessarily tied to the first action that gave rise to these works. Lastly, this is why the blessing of temporal preservation is attached to the blessing of production for the same temporal things, as one essentially derives from the other. Temporal things are created to exist for a certain time. How could they exist during this time allocated to them if there weren't a blessing that preserved their existence? Finally, The blessing of reintegration of matter is the final act of its existence. This act, repeated every day through the destruction of individual bodies, sufficiently indicates how it will occur for the general dissolution, as we have agreed that the laws governing them are the same. This third operation is still called a blessing because not only is it ordained by the power and wisdom of the same being who ordained the other two, but it is also executed by the same agent and using the same means. It is always this eternal and universal Word, the Word of the Son, that must loosen the very bonds of temporal creation, just as this Word initially attached them in their origin and sustains them since nature began to exist in apparent material form. This Word of reintegration will manifest through the operations of the seven principal universal agents, the same ones destined in the beginning of things to sustain creation.
And that is where I think I'll leave it off. It's been 20 minutes, and I'd like to pick that up in the next episode because that is the premise of manuscript 4127 from the BMG, or Bibliothèque Municipale Grenoble, which is called the Nouvelle Coen Instruction, the New Coen Instruction. But it's really not. It's called "You're going to get grace based on your conduct," pretty much. That the Eternal will give us grace based on our conduct, which is such a wonderful place to pick up in the next episode. So, at that point, we've been on for about 20 minutes or so. I don't want to keep these too long because, people get bored. But thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of the Being Reintegrated podcast.